So we ended up specifically discussing utilitarianism and the greatest good for the greatest number. And I'll just continue the third tranche of week 1 as I have promised the class. This will last until the end of the slides or the presentation. So please bear with me. Utilitarianism. When we speak of utilitarianism, we need to understand that this is the theory that is often used to put side by side with Kant, precisely because it technically is contrary to Kant. So the third major ethical tradition is often associated with John Stuart Mill. Notice immediately how different this approach is from Aristotle and Kant. Aristotle asks, what kind of person should I become? Kant asks, what is my duty? Utilitarianism asks, what decision produces the greatest overall good? This shift is enormously important because much of modern public administration already thinks this way. Whenever governments conduct cost-benefit analysis, allocate limited budgets, prioritize infrastructure, evaluate social programs, or estimate policy outcomes, they often employ utilitarian reasoning. Public administrators constantly face situations where resources are scarce. There may not be enough vaccines for everyone, not enough classrooms, not enough disaster funds, not enough hospital beds. Someone must decide how these limited resources should be distributed. Utilitarianism proposes that we choose the option producing the greatest benefit for the greatest number. Notice why this framework has become attractive in government. It encourages evidence-based policy making. It emphasizes measurable outcomes. It requires leaders to think beyond individual interests toward collective welfare. At the same time, this framework introduces difficult questions that we will examine next. What happens when maximizing overall welfare disadvantages a minority? Can the happiness of many justify injustice toward a few? These questions reveal that every ethical framework solves certain problems while introducing new ones. Our task as students of ethics is not merely to memorize theories. It is to understand the strengths, assumptions, and even limitations of each framework so that as future public administrators, we may exercise power with greater wisdom, greater justice, and deeper moral responsibility. We have now encountered three powerful approaches to ethics: Aristotle's virtue, Kant's duty, and Mill's consequences. The next slide explores why utilitarianism has become so influential in modern government and why it remains both indispensable and controversial. Look carefully at the title of this slide, Maximizing Public Welfare. This captures the heart of utilitarian thinking. According to utilitarianism, the morally right decision is the one that produces the greatest overall benefit for the greatest number of people. Notice the phrase overall benefit. Utilitarianism evaluates actions not primarily by intentions, but by consequences. The moral worth of a policy depends on what it accomplishes. This explains why utilitarianism fits naturally within public administration. Governments constantly allocate scarce resources. Budgets are always limited. Needs are always greater than available funds. Every peso spent on one project cannot simultaneously be spent on another. Consider the example on the vaccine priority problem. Imagine that only 1,000 vaccine doses remain, but 10,000 people require vaccination. Who should receive them first? Should healthcare workers receive priority because protecting them allows them to save many others? Should the elderly receive priority because they face the highest immediate risk of death? Should children receive priority because they have longer futures ahead of them? Each answer attempts to maximize public welfare, yet each identifies welfare differently. Notice something very important. The calculation itself is not morally neutral. Before we can calculate benefits, we must first decide what counts as a benefit. Is saving the greatest number always the highest good? Should years of life be considered? Economic productivity, protection of the vulnerable, reduction of suffering. These are not scientific questions alone. They are ethical ones. This illustrates why public administration cannot rely exclusively on economics or statistics. Data may tell us what will happen. Ethics helps us decide what ought to happen. Utilitarianism, therefore, reminds us that public leadership often requires difficult choices between competing goods rather than between obvious good and obvious evil. But precisely because utilitarianism emphasizes the welfare of the majority, philosophers began asking an uncomfortable question. What happens to those who belong to the minority? This is perhaps the most serious critique ever directed against utilitarianism. Read the question carefully. Can minority rights be sacrificed for majority benefit? At first glance, maximizing the welfare of 90% of the population seems obviously desirable. But suppose doing so consistently harms the remaining 10%. Is such a policy just? History teaches us that this is not merely a philosophical problem. Majorities have often supported discriminatory laws. Majorities have justified political repression. Majorities have approved policies that marginalized indigenous peoples, religious minorities, persons with disabilities, or economically disadvantaged communities. If the only measure of morality is the happiness of the majority, then the suffering of minorities may become morally invisible. That is the danger. Utilitarian reasoning, when left without limits, can unintentionally justify oppression. It can argue that silencing dissent creates social stability. It can argue that restricting the rights of a few produces greater security for many. It can argue that unequal treatment is acceptable because most citizens benefit. Notice how quickly efficiency can begin replacing justice. For democratic governance, this creates a permanent tension. Governments must certainly pursue the welfare of the majority, but they must also protect the dignity and rights of every individual, especially those with the least political power. This criticism of utilitarianism eventually inspired one of the most influential political philosophers of the 20th century, John Rawls. Rawls agreed that government should seek the common good, but he argued that justice must come before calculations of collective welfare. We now arrive at the final major ethical framework that we are introducing in this week one's lecture. John Rawls' theory of justice as fairness. Rawls wrote during the 20th century when democracies were increasingly confronting questions of inequality, civil rights, poverty, social justice. He admired many aspects of utilitarianism but believed it overlooked something essential. A society cannot be considered just simply because most people are happy. Justice requires something more fundamental, in fact. Justice requires something more. Rawls, therefore, asks us what this is. He says, imagine society from a totally different perspective. Instead of beginning with our current position, our health, our wealth, he says, don't begin there. Our ethnicity, our religion, our political influence, Rawls asks us to imagine that none of these are known. Why? Because fairness becomes easier when personal interests disappear. Think about ordinary life. People often support policies because they personally benefit, tax benefits, tax policies, scholarships, government subsidies, healthcare programs, employment regulations. It is natural to defend policies that favor themselves or that favor ourselves. Rawls asks us to suspend these personal interests temporarily and ask a deeper question. What's the deeper question? What kind of society would be fair if we did not know who we were going to become? That simple question transformed modern political thinking. It shifted ethical reasoning away from self-interest and toward impartial justice. To explain this idea, Rawls introduces one of the most famous thought experiments in philosophy, the veil of ignorance. Imagine for a moment that you're about to design an entirely new society. You will write its constitution, you will write its constitution, you will establish its laws, you will design its educational system, healthcare system, taxation, labor policies, and legal institutions. There is only one condition. You do not know who you will become once that society begins. You may become rich, you may become poor, you may belong to the majority, you may belong to a minority, you may be healthy, you may live with disability, you may be born in the capital city, or you may grow up in a geographically isolated community. Rawls calls this situation the veil of ignorance. Why is it powerful? Because it moves personal bias. Without knowing our future position, we naturally begin designing institutions that protect everyone. No rational person would deliberately create an educational system that neglects poor children if there is a chance that he himself will become poor. No rational person would weaken healthcare if she herself might later become seriously ill. No rational person would weaken No rational person would design institutions that discriminate against minorities if there is a possibility of belonging to that majority or minority. Notice the elegance of Rawls' argument. Justice emerges not from generosity, it emerges from fairness. We become just because we recognize that we ourselves could occupy any position within society. This is one of the strongest ethical foundations for democratic governance. But Rawls does not leave his theory inside philosophy. He tells public administrators exactly how this way of thinking should influence policy making. Roles and public administration. We need to translate Rawls's philosophical thought experiment into a practical guide for governance. We offer one remarkably simple principle. Design policies, design policies you would accept in any position. Notice how demanding that principle is. Suppose you are drafting a housing policy. Would you still support it if you were one of the poorest citizens? Suppose you are designing a scholarship program. Would you still appear fair if your own family failed to qualify? Suppose you are designing a scholarship program. Would it appear fair if your family failed to qualify there? That's something worth considering. Would the distribution still seem just if your municipality received the smallest allocation? Rawls asks every public administrator to leave the comfort of personal advantage and imagine standing in every possible position within society. This transformation changes policymaking. Instead of asking, does this policy benefit my supporters? We ask, would any rational citizen consider this policy fair regardless of where they happen to stand? Notice how these complements the ethical traditions we have studied. Aristotle reminds us to cultivate virtuous character. Kant reminds us to fulfill our moral duty. Mill reminds us to consider consequences for society. Rawls reminds us never to forget fairness. Together, these four traditions provide a remarkably rich framework for ethical public leadership. They teach us that good governance requires more than administrative competence. It requires moral imagination, practical wisdom, unwavering integrity, concern for the common good, and a commitment to justice that extends especially to those whose voices are least heard. As future public administrators, your challenge will never simply be to manage institutions efficiently. Your challenge will be to govern them ethically. Let's look at the four ethical framework at a glance. Before we proceed to the practical applications of ethics, let's pause and look back at the journey we have taken. Philosophy often feels complicated because we study one thinker after another. Aristotle emphasizes virtue, arete. Kant emphasizes duty or dion. Mill emphasizes consequences. And Rawls emphasizes justice. It can seem as though these philosophers are competing with one another, but we need to be reminded that they are not competitors but conversation partners. Look carefully at the four questions presented here. The first asks, what kind of person am I becoming? This is Aristotle's question. Ethics begins with the formation of character. Leadership depends not simply on what we know, but on who we have become. The second asks, what is my obligation regardless of consequences? This is Kant's contribution. Some actions remain right even when they are difficult, unpopular, or personally costly. Duty protects morality from becoming merely convenient. The third asks, which choice produces the greatest benefit? Here we enter utilitarian reasoning. Public officials constantly allocate scarce resources, evaluate competing priorities, and seek outcomes that improve the welfare of the greatest number of citizens. Finally, Rawls asks perhaps the most challenging question. And what is that? What should I choose behind the veil of ignorance? Before approving any policy, imagine that you do not know whether you will become rich or poor, influential or marginalized, healthy or disabled. Would you still consider the policy fair? Notice something profound. Each framework highlights something the others might overlook. Virtue without concern for consequences may become naive. Consequences without justice may become oppressive. Duty without compassion may become rigid. Justice without character cannot sustain itself. Good public administrators, therefore, do not become disciples of only one philosopher. They develop the wisdom to all four questions before making important decisions even. This is why the note at the bottom of the slide is important. These frameworks are not rankings. They are lenses. Mature ethical judgment requires learning when each lens helps us see what another lenses misses. We now move from philosophical theories to a more personal question. If ethics ultimately concerns leadership, what exactly is leadership? Is it simply occupying a position of authority? That's the next question we would like to engage. At this point, we have explored several ethical traditions, yet one misunderstanding remains remarkably common, especially in public administration. Many people assume that leadership begins when someone receives an appointment, a promotion, a designation, an election, a title. We challenge that assumption. Leadership is not about position. Notice the sentence beneath it. Before we proceed to the case discussion, we must challenge one of the most common misconceptions about leadership in public administration. That misconception is simple. People often confuse authority with leadership. Authority may be granted overnight. Leadership cannot. Authority is given through law. Leadership is earned through trust. Authority comes from institutions. Leadership comes from people willingly following someone they believe deserves their confidence. Think of your own experience. Perhaps you have worked under a supervisor who possessed complete authority but inspired almost no one. People complied because they had to. Meetings became mechanical. Communication became defensive. Creativity disappeared. Now think of another person. Perhaps a teacher, a military officer, a parish leader, or even a classmate who possessed very little formal authority yet inspired others naturally. People volunteered, they cooperated, they trusted. Notice the difference. Leadership begins long before formal positions. It begins the moment others recognize integrity, competence, and genuine concern for the common good. This insight prepares us for perhaps the most important distinction in public leadership. If leadership is not identical with authority, then what distinguishes the two? Let's look at the next slide. Authority is not the same as leadership. Look at the first definition of authority. Authority is the formal power granted by position, title, or appointment. It can be conferred through election, legislation, organizational hierarchy, or executive designation. Authority allows a person to issue directives, approve documents, allocate resources, or enforce regulations. Notice something important here. Authority can be given instantly. A newly appointed municipal administrator possesses legal authority on the very first day of office. Now compare these with the definition of leadership. Leadership is described not primarily in legal terms, but in moral terms. It requires credibility, integrity, influence, and genuine concern for others. Leadership cannot simply be announced, it must be demonstrated, and demonstrated repeatedly. Look at the right side of the slide. These this distinction is captured beautifully there. We see a barangay hall, a familiar setting in Philippine public administration, and every day citizens come to barangay offices requesting clearances, assistance, mediation, or certification. Imagine two barangay officials, both occupy the same office, both possess exactly the same legal authority. One treats every citizen respectfully, listens patiently, explains procedures clearly, and serves with fairness. The other delays applications unnecessarily, humiliates applicants, favors political supporters, and abuses subordinates. Legally, they possess identical authority. Morally, they exercise entirely different leadership. Notice the sentence at the bottom of the slide. A clerk who serves citizens with honesty can and care exhibit ethical leadership. A director who abuses staff and manipulates procedure exhibits none. People ultimately follow genuine leaders because they trust them, not merely because they fear them. Fear may secure obedience, trust secures commitment. This distinction explains why organizations led by ethical leaders often exceed expectations without constant supervision, while organizations governed only by authority require continuous monitoring, coercion, and enforcement. If leadership depends upon trust rather than mere authority, then another human capacity becomes essential. Ethical leaders must learn to imagine how their decisions affect people. And when we're talking already about leaders imagining, we go now into the realm of moral imagination. Having distinguished authority from leadership, we now arrive at one of the deepest concepts in contemporary public ethics: moral imagination. Read the introductory paragraph carefully. It begins with an important acknowledgement. Technical competence is necessary. No ethical administrator should be incompetent. Good intentions cannot compensate for poor budgeting, for weak planning, inaccurate statistics, or ineffective implementation. But notice the second statement. technical competence is not sufficient. This is where moral imagination enters. Public administration increasingly requires a capacity that no spreadsheet can calculate and no performance dashboard can fully measure. What is moral imagination? It is the ability to imagine the human consequences of administrative decisions before those consequences occur. Every government policy eventually enters someone's life. A budget becomes a classroom. A regulation becomes a waiting line. A procurement decision becomes medicine or the absence of which. A transportation policy becomes a student's daily commute. Administrative decisions eventually become lived human experiences. The ethical public administrator, therefore, develops the habit of asking not only will this policy work, but also how will this policy be experienced by the people who must live with it. Moral imagination bridges the distance between bureaucracy and humanity. Without citizens, Without it, citizens become statistics. With it, statistics become persons. Let's push this a little bit more by talking about going beyond KPIs and budgets. On the one side, we find technical competence. These are indispensable skills every public administrator must possess: budget management, performance indicators, statistical analysis, procurement procedures, program implementations. These matter enormously. An administrator who lacks these competencies can unintentionally waste public resources, delay essential services, and undermine institutional effectiveness. Incompetence itself becomes an ethical problem because citizens suffer from poor administration. But now look at the blue box on the right. This is moral imagination. Notice the questions. Who will be affected by this decision? Whose voice is unheard in this room? What kind of society are we creating? What does justice require here? What are we sacrificing for efficiency? These questions cannot be answered by algorithms. No spreadsheets calculates dignity. No performance indicator measures hope. No procurement manual tells us whether citizens feel respected. Those questions require ethical reflection. They require imagination. They require wisdom. And this explains also the concluding sentences on the slide. Good administration is not merely efficient, it is human. That statement perhaps summarizes our lecture. Ethics is not an optional supplement added to public administration. Ethics is what gives technical competence its purpose. Budgets matter because people matter. Policies matter because people matter. Institutions matter because people matter. Leadership ultimately exists not to preserve organizations for their own sake, but to enable persons and communities to flourish. Can you still remember the opening question at the beginning of these week's lectures? The question, is legal compliance enough? After we have studied from Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and Rawls to authority, leadership, and moral imagination, we can now answer with greater confidence. Ethical public leadership requires far more than following rules. It requires becoming the kind of leader whose character, judgment, sense of duty, concern for the common good, commitment to justice, and moral imagination inspire citizens to entrust their lives to public institutions. Now let's look at these. And everybody is required to submit your opinion on this piece. We have explored ethical theories one at a time. We have examined Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and Rawls separately. But real public administration never presents ethical questions in neat categories. Reality presents us with cases. That is why we need to introduce our first case. Imagine yourself as a provincial administrator. You have sufficient funds to finance only one flood control project. You cannot build both. Delay is not an option. Your recommendation will determine who receives protection before the next rainy season. Immediately notice that this is not an simply an engineering problem, but an ethical one. Project A protects a wealthy commercial district. The benefits are obvious. Businesses continue operating. Employment remains stable. Tax revenues remain strong. The local economy continues growing. From a financial perspective, this appears to be an effective investment. Project B, however, protects a poorer residential community. It contributes far less to local tax revenue, yet its residents face significantly greater risks during every typhoon season. Homes are destroyed, livelihoods disappear, families are displaced, human lives are endangered. Now, pause. Pause. Your first instinct may be to choose one project immediately. Resist the temptation. The purpose of this exercise is not to discover the correct answer as quickly as possible. The purpose is to understand how we arrive at an ethical judgment. Look carefully at the illustration on the right side. We do not simply see flooded streets, we see people carrying possessions, families attempting to protect one another, children standing in floodwater, neighbors helping neighbors move belongings to higher ground. Notice what the image accomplishes. It transforms infrastructure into human experience. Flood control is no longer merely about draining canals. It becomes a question about whose suffering society chooses to prevent. Every budget decision eventually becomes someone's lived reality. That is why administration is never morally neutral. Today, you're not simply allocating money. You're allocating security, dignity, opportunity, and perhaps even life itself. This is precisely why ethical reflection must precede administrative action. Fortunately, we are not approaching this dilemma without guidance. We have already encountered four major ethical traditions, and let us allow each philosophers to analyze exactly the same situation. So notice that every philosopher asks a different question about exactly the same problem. The facts do not change, only the ethical lens changes. Let's begin with Aristotle. Aristotle does not immediately ask which project saves the most money, no, nor does he begin by calculating consequences. Instead, he asks, what would a virtuous leader choose? A leader possessing justice, prudence, compassion, and practical wisdom would seek the decision that best expresses excellent character while genuinely serving the common good. Now consider Kant. His question sounds different. What duty does government owes every citizen? Notice the challenge written here. Are poorer citizens somehow less deserving of protection because they contribute less to tax revenue? Kant's answer is immediate. Absolutely not. Human dignity never depends upon economic productivity. Government owes equal moral respect to every citizen simply because every citizen possesses inherent worth. Mill now enters the discussion. His question concerns consequences. Which option produces the greatest overall benefit? But immediately another question follows. How should we define benefit? Should we prioritize protecting the greatest number of lives, maximizing economic productivity, reducing long-term disaster costs, maintaining employment? Notice that utilitarianism still requires moral judgment because someone must determine what counts as the greatest good. Finally, Rawls. He asks perhaps the simplest questions. Imagine you do not know yet whether you will be born wealthy or poor. Which project would you choose? That is the veil of ignorance. Notice what has happened. One administrative problem has generated four ethical conversations. Rather than creating confusion, these perspectives deepen our understanding. Each framework illuminates something the other risks overlooking. This is precisely why ethical education matters and matters a lot. After examining the case through these four philosophical lenses, what have we actually learned? Must they always produce exactly the same recommendation? Of course not. This is one of the most important lessons we have so far. Many students initially assume that ethical theories exist to provide identical answers. They do not. Sometimes they agree, sometimes they disagree, and that is perfectly normal. Notice the first point. Sometimes frameworks agree. There are situations where Aristotle concerned for virtue, Kant's commitment to duty, Mill's concern for public welfare, and Rawls' commitment to fairness all converge upon the same recommendations. It's possible. When this occurs, public administrators may actually may act with considerable confidence because multiple ethical tradition support the same decision. Notice, however, the second point. Sometimes frameworks conflict. This does not necessarily mean one philosopher is correct and the other is mistaken. Instead, genuine ethical dilemmas emerge precisely because important values compete. Justice competes with efficiency. Duty competes with consequences. Fairness competes with aggregate welfare. Compassion competes with institutional constraints. Public administration, therefore, cannot always eliminate moral conflict. Sometimes leadership requires carrying the burden of difficult choices where every available option involves sacrifice. And this leads us to the third insight. Conflict demands practical wisdom. We have already encountered Aristotle's concept of phronesis. Now we understand why it matters. No regulation can resolve every ethical conflict. No ethics code anticipates every circumstance. No administrative manual can substitute for mature judgment. Practical wisdom enables leaders to weigh competing obligations without abandoning integrity. It allows administrators to recognize complexity without surrendering moral conviction. In other words, philosophy has not eliminated uncertainty. It has prepared us to navigate uncertainty responsibly. Having completed our case discussion, we now return to the question by which we began the lecture. At the beginning of the lecture, I've asked a deceptively simple question. Can a leader remain perfectly legal and still be unethical? At that moment, many of us hesitated. Now, after everything we have discussed, the answer should indeed be clearer. Ethics is not merely the avoidance of punishment. If avoiding punishment were enough, then the most ethical public servant would simply be the one who never gets caught. But surely we know that this cannot be true. Ethics concerns something much deeper. It concerns the cultivation of persons and institutions worthy of public trust. Notice the beautiful progression. Every administrative decision affects human lives. Budgets are not simply numbers, they express priorities. Policies are not simply procedures, they embody values. Leadership is not merely coordination, it shapes institutional culture. Eventually, every organization begins resembling the moral character of its leaders. This is why ethical leadership matters. When leaders repeatedly demonstrate honesty, fairness, humility, and responsibility, those virtues slowly become organizational. Likewise, when leaders repeatedly tolerate dishonesty, favoritism, intimidation, indifference, those habits also become organizational culture. Institutions eventually become reflections of the people entrusted to lead them. Ethics, therefore, concerns not only personal morality, it concerns the morality of organizations we leave behind. Our final slide returns to the original question, but a little bit deeper. Notice the two questions. The first asks, did I follow the law? The slide immediately answers, this is necessary, but it is not enough. Every public administrator must obey the law. Without legality, there can be no legitimate government. But legality alone cannot guarantee justice. History has repeatedly shown that perfectly legal decisions may still violate human dignity. The second question, therefore, becomes far more demanding. Did I exercise power in a way that promoted justice, preserved human dignity, and served the common good? Notice how this single sentence quietly brings together everything we have studied so far. Aristotle reminds us to cultivate the virtues necessary to answer this question well. Kant reminds us never to sacrifice duty or human dignity. Mill reminds us to consider the consequences of our decisions for society. Rawls reminds us to ensure fairness, especially for those with the least power. Ethics, therefore, becomes neither abstract philosophy nor administrative compliance. It becomes a way of exercising power. Every signature, every budget, every appointment, every permit, every regulation, every policy, every administrative decision becomes an opportunity either to strengthen or weaken justice. As public administrators, you will possess enormous authority, but your legacy will not ultimately be measured by how many memoranda you signed, how many projects you completed, or how many regulations you enforced. Your legacy will be measured by whether the people entrusted to your care experienced government as something worthy of their trust. That is why this final sentence is important. This is the question that will guide the rest of this course. Throughout this lecture and the remaining lectures, we will repeatedly return to this single question. Not merely was it legal, but was it worthy of the human person, worthy of the public trust, and worthy of the power entrusted to me? That is the heart of ethics, and that is the true vocation of public leadership. As we conclude our first lecture, uh, I'll just like to take note the direction of the course and how we're going to move forward. So, notice the title, The Course Ahead. This is more than a syllabus. It's a map of intellectual and professional formation. So the first lecture establishes the moral foundation and that everything which follows, power, leadership, and institutional governance, builds upon it. That statement is extremely important. Many public administration programs begins by discussing budgeting, planning, organization, personal management, policy implementation. Those are important topics, but this course, it deliberately begins somewhere deeper. Why? Because techniques are only as good as the values that guide them. An efficient administrator without ethics can become an efficient oppressor. A brilliant planner without integrity can design systems that benefit only the powerful. A skilled manager without justice can create organizations that function well while quietly harming the people they are meant to serve. That is why ethics comes first. Look at that one in the center. The journey begins with ethics. Ethics asks why power should exist at all. From ethics, we move to power then. Future lectures this week will examine the acquisition of power, the exercise of power, and unfortunately, the corruption of power. We will discover that power is never merely something a person possesses, but always reshapes relationships, institutions, and communities. Finally, the path leads towards ethical governance. Notice the wordings, not simply governance, not merely administration, but institutions and leaders committed to justice. That is the designation. The goal is therefore not simply to produce technically competent administrators, but to help form public servants capable of building institutions worthy of public trust. The movement from ethics to power to governance is not merely a course outline, but the journey every public servant must make throughout an entire career. That is beautifully said. Your career will constantly revisit these three realities. You will repeatedly ask, what is right? How should power be exercised? How do we build institutions that citizens trust? Those questions never disappear. They accompany every promotion, every appointment, every policy decision, and every opportunity to lead. This course is simply helping you begin by asking them well. So let's look at the key takeaways from this course and allow me to summarize it this way. So as we conclude the first week and start the second week actually tomorrow, let us summarize the 6 central insights that should remain with you long after today's lecture. First, ethics is foundational, not optional. Ethics is not an additional chapter attached to public administration. It is the very condition that makes legitimate government possible. Without ethics, public administration becomes mere bureaucracy. Without trust, authority eventually becomes coercion. Every institution ultimately depends not simply upon law, but upon moral credibility. Second, law sets the floor. Ethics seeks the ceiling. This may be the single most important distinction in this week's lecture. The law asks, can I do this? Ethics asks, should I do this? Legal compliance protects us from punishment. Ethical leadership inspires public confidence. The best public servants never ask only what is legally permissible. They ask what genuinely serves the public good. Third, morality, ethics, law, and professionalism are distinct. Morality consists of inherited customs and values. Ethics critically examines those values. Law establishes enforceable minimum standards. Professionalism transforms ethical principles into daily habits. Understanding these distinctions enables administrators to think more clearly and act more responsibly. Fourth, power demands moral responsibility. Throughout this week's lecture, we repeatedly return to one simple observation. Every administrative decision changes someone's life. Budget affects schools. Personnel decisions affects families. Permits affects livelihoods. Policies affect entire communities. Power itself is morally neutral. Its ethical significance depends entirely upon how it is exercised. Fifth, for traditions provide four contemporary lenses. Aristotle asks, what kind of person should I become? Kant asks, what is my duty? Mill asks, what produces the greatest good? Rawls asks, what would be fair if I did not know my own position? Notice that none of these traditions completely replaces the others. Each contributes something indispensable. Together, they provide a remarkably rich vocabulary for ethical reflection. Sixth, leadership is fundamentally ethical. Throughout this lecture, we gradually dismantled a common misunderstanding. Leadership is not primarily about authority. It's not about organizational rank. It's not about technical expertise alone. Leadership is fundamentally a moral practice grounded in credibility, integrity, practical wisdom, justice, and the concern for the common good. People may obey authority because they must. They follow ethical leaders because they trust them. That is the difference. Let's conclude this lecture. As we conclude our first week, let us return to the very question with which we began. Imagine that every decision you make as public officials is perfectly legal, yet every decision slowly erodes public trust. Have you become an ethical leader simply because you followed the law? Many of us were uncertain. Now we possess a richer answer. We discovered that ethics is not simply compliance with rules. It is the moral foundation upon which public administration itself rests. Government do not endure merely because they possess the law. Police, budgets, technology, they endure because citizens continue to trust those entrusted with public power. We distinguish law from ethics, recognizing that legality establishes minimum standards while ethics calls leaders towards excellence. We clarified the relationship among morality, ethics, law, and professionalism, showing how inherited values become rationally examined principles and eventually habitual public service. We then explored profoundly the relationship between ethics and power. And we've looked at the four ethical traditions of Aristotle, Kant, Mill, and Rawls. If there's one sentence that basically captures the entire lecture, it's this: public administration is never merely the management of institutions. It is the ethical stewardship of power entrusted by citizens for the common good. Everything that follows, our discussion on political power, organizational leadership, corruption, accountability, public service motivation, institutional reform, or even ethical governance, will build upon this single conviction. As public administrators, the greatest challenge will not simply be to govern effectively. It will be to govern in such a way that people you serve can continue to trust both you and the institutions you represent. That is, I think, the true vocation of a public servant. We're done with the week 1 lecture. Please expect the week 2 lecture to come and follow next. Thank you and have a nice day, everyone.